Hey, what's going on, guys? Here to bring you just like a little breakdown of what I think of North American Contenders and just give my thoughts on some of the teams here. Got a list here, got some things in my brain. I've played half these teams probably, and I just want to give like a little breakdown and my thoughts on what I think of all the teams and how I think the contender standings will actually ending up in the future. So we'll go bit by bit. I'm gonna go 12 to 1 basically, even though they are in group stages. I will talk about each one and what I think of them. So first, there's a bit of a hate train in the tier 3 scene about this team, but I think 12th place without a doubt has got to be one of us. They were really underwhelming. The way they really won a lot of their games was running quad tank and really abusing that and running like weird strategies, and I don't hate them for that, but they used it as a crutch and really abused it against teams that were like really weak to it, and it just leaves like a bit of a bad taste in your mouth. And with any of the experience that I've seen watching like higher level games, you run quad tank into pro teams and they just roll you. Like they just run dive into you, they just discord your Moira and your Lucio and they just kill you, and the tanks really can't do anything. The Zarya ends up sitting with zero energy for the entire game, and you end up just running to a brick wall, speed boosting into like dive over and over again and dying. I don't hate some of the parts on this roster though. Dogman was on our roster and he was doing really good for himself. Aether was a tryout on my team initially, and I think he's done a really good job for himself. He's really improved as a player. But a lot of the players you won't recognize, and that's for a reason. A lot of them really aren't that well known. Maybe Shershoy being the other one who's kind of known, but a lot of them, I feel like they're somewhat underwhelming. They've not really been practiced on a lot of things. Maybe Sombrata can like fit somewhere in like this new Sombra meta because he has a lot of Sombra hours, but a lot of them are kind of just like maybe still in the tier 3 scene, and quad tank really carried them, so I think they're going to like really struggle moving into this new meta of dive, because the times that we've played dive v dive against them, it's been really one-sided in our favor. So moving on from that, I want to talk about Mayhem next. Now, we have one of my former players, Paintbrush. I worked with him for a few months at least on different teams. I don't hate him, but I feel like the roster around him isn't the best that they could have gotten. I think they have good pieces, but he was a flex support initially on the teams that I've coached him, and then we kind of transitioned him into this Lucio role just because he was such a strong caller. But the problem lies is that he's now stuck on Lucio, where we just had done that before because of how our team was set up. But he would still play Zen when we needed him to. But now he's actually playing Lucio still on this team, which doesn't make any sense. His Zen is actually insane. It's probably one of the better ones here. But he's sticking on that role, and they have Moore playing it, which really doesn't make a lot of sense because Moore's a weaker Zen player than him. So I think if you wanted to have these two supports, then maybe you'd just transition more into being a Lucio player. But it's kind of odd, and it kind of really doesn't make a lot of sense. But I guess you kind of have to deal with it. The rest of the players on here have all been like pieces, but I think they've been more so role players on other teams that they've been on. So Mikey A on Cloud9 wasn't really a carry player. Like, sure, he played a carry role, but there's a reason why he wasn't like picked up like a lot of other ones of his teammates. Pizza, he's another case where he was on a team that had a lot of winning, strong pieces, but he never really got carried up onto that. I'm wondering if that's attitude or other things, but I'm not exactly sure. But I've not played this team yet, but I don't expect a lot from them, and their upward trajectory really depends on self improvement from them. I think they have pieces that have like been on winning teams, so I'm not sure if that's the way you win games, but I'd have to see what their coach can do, if he can like cook something up so that this team can actually be a winning team. I don't expect it, but I know Paintbrush can shot call really well, so maybe he can find some solution for this team. Next, we'll talk about Grizzlies. I'm not sure if people have the right read on this team. I've seen a few people place this team like a little bit higher than I think they deserve to be on. When my team played this team, it wasn't really close at all. Like, I've also had a few of my players try out for this team, and they just don't feel that good. Like, I'm not sure why this group of people was put together. I think it was a lot of these contenders rosters were put together with players that had previous experience and were considered good at one point, but I don't know if they're in like their peak form as of right now. And I think other players who are more deserving but aren't as known would probably fit better on this roster. So there's a lot of known names on here, but a lot of them don't play. Like they have two substitute players, and I think they pretty much just play with a six-man roster, and they've just been like pretty underwhelming when we've played against them. So there's not a lot to say. I think a lot of them, I don't know if it's fair to say that they're washed up, but they aren't at their peak forms, and it's going to be really tough for them to play against some of these better teams that are really cohesive and have a lot of superstar talent on them. So I'm placing them lower, and I don't expect them to climb as high. Maybe they can surprise us, but it's going to be pretty tough with the pieces that they have. All right, we have number 9, last night's leftovers. This is another team we played against and scrimmed a bunch. I think they're a really well put together team, especially in the tier 3 scene. I think what kind of held them back a little bit, maybe just like a little bit, was ping. So if some of the players end up coming to NA, and if it's more of a long-term project and they get picked up by an org, then they can be like a really good team because their EU DPS are actually really good. Ajax and Dummy, I don't think they're as bad as people put them. They were definitely overhyped on Energy, and Energy wasn't going to be some like world beater team, and I think that was too much expectation put on them, so they felt underwhelming. But I think as a duo, they're pretty solid tier 2 support players, and I think this is definitely a league that they can stick in for a while, and I think this is a good team to build around. Now, I think the problem that's going to like rise up from this is that their DPS are good for tier 2 level, but when we start to move into these other teams, we start to see superstar DPS that might be owl caliber or might just be a little bit too good for them to compete with, and their team might have too much cohesion and too much pro experience that they really need to catch up to them. So I'm placing them a bit lower also because they're a newer team and they aren't all have been pro players. So I think they have some upward climb. Maybe they can climb to like a little bit higher of the middle of the pack, but I'm placing them at like a little bit of a lower level because I don't have the most faith in them, but I think they have done really well as a team, and they've done really well against my team. So all right, next we're going to go to Simplicity at 8th. Now, this is a team that's pretty confusing to me. I think this is more so, I'm not sure if it's fair to say, I don't know if I want to say that. They're a bit confusing to me as how they were put together. So Zoms just seems a bit confusing in the fact that you watch him all day long playing hit scan, and then he's not skilled enough as a tracer player to compete with other tracer players, so he's forced to play Diva. But you don't see him really putting in the time to play Diva, so he's been kind of underwhelming as an off-tank player. I know we've seen Azaria sometimes just because his hit scan is really good, but his Diva play is really underwhelming. It's not that good. Their support lineup is very confusing. I've not really seen Faz for a long time, and I think his name's kind of just held a little bit of value from Rise Nation, and he's not really stuck around and been a top player. And Gingerpop felt more like he should be a main support, so it feels like they kind of have two main supports with not really a carry threat, and their support pool doesn't feel like it can be the strongest if we do end up switching supports. And in this meta, it feels like you can run Ana Zen on some maps, you can run Moira Zen on some maps, Lucio Moira, Mercy Lucio, Mercy Zen, so it feels like there's a lot of things that they'd have to pick up on, and I feel like these two would be best in a Lucio Mercy or Lucio Zen meta where it's stable all the time and they don't have to swap as much and they aren't as dynamic as players. I have not seen much of DPS as a tank player, so it's hard for me to comment on him. KSF and Xretzi are both good DPS players, but as we climb up further into this list, you'll see that they're kind of just outclassed, so I feel like this is a good okay middle of the pack team where they'll probably struggle against the top teams, and maybe the lower teams they can end up just beating up on. But I think this team's really going to struggle, and I think they might actually go lower than the 8th place, but we'll see. Next, we'll move on to Toronto. I think this is one of the harder teams to comment on, just because they had such a winning formula with Toronto before they split the roster up, and now they kind of just didn't like the fact that they had that roster and having it have so much control. So like you have like all these players and you just like give them all the control basically. I think they had to split some of them up, and I don't know if these are the right pieces to slot back in. They were working well with Koreans before, but they're putting in new ones, so it's a bit of a question mark as if their communication is going to be good. But the English speakers they have on this team are excellent. Dalton is he's an insane tracer player. I mean that's the only thing you can say about that. He's actually insane. It's really hard for him to compete, or for others to compete with him. Nero is also insane. Mossman a staple, top tier 2 support talent for the longest time. It's hard to see how these Koreans will slot in because I haven't really seen them much on their own in Korea, and then seeing them put on this NA org, it's going to be a little bit difficult to see how they'll round up. But having really strong 3-man core of Toronto, moving it to this org, into this Contenders, we'll see probably flashes of brilliance from them, but we'll have to see what the rest of the roster will do slotting into this already established system that they have. Next, we'll move on to Optic. Now, I think I'm rating them a bit highly just because I think they have good pieces on the team, but I'm not 100% sure if I'm okay with this. I think I'm assuming that Optic is going to coach some of these players, and some of the older, more experienced players are going to take like a leadership role on this team, and so I'm more so assuming Kaiser will take like a very hard carry role in this team, because besides him, there's a lot of people who've been kind of hovering around that tier 2, kind of like middle of the pack scene for a while, and they haven't really shown up. So I think this team has like a lot of room to climb, maybe, if the players can learn and they're actually willing to like really commit to improvement, then maybe they can climb up. But I think I've probably placed this team like highly just for the fact that I think Kaiser is such like a good tank player that maybe he can like teach some of the things that Runaway taught him, and like really guide this team to being like really good, being a great leader in the fact, and maybe his name can like bring on stronger talent to this roster. But a lot of the other talent, my team's played against them and we 2-0'd them. It was close, but I mean we were weak at the time and we still were able to beat them. Granted, Kaiser wasn't in the roster, but if you're dropping games against like a weaker roster, then there's not a lot that you can expect from a team like this. I probably rated them maybe a bit too highly, but I think that they have upward trajectory, and Kaiser might be able to like carry these players in the future. So we'll move on to Energy. Energy is probably the biggest question mark team here besides Toronto. Because this is like a really weird mix of players, and you kind of get a weird, like, it's like a cross of like Korea, NA, and EU with all the players. And there's also people like role swapping. So Fozix used to be a flex support player, he's now moving into a main support role. I don't know what that's going to mean. I know he was a strong caller and a very competent player and knew the meta and knew how to call and had a very strong read on what he wants his team to do. So I don't doubt that he'll be a good caller, but learning a new role can be different, especially in this kind of like volatile state of like supports. So maybe he'll be stuck on Lucio and he won't be as comfortable, but we'll see. Lucio seems to be a role that a lot of people can just pick up and like work with, but we'll see. Damon is probably like one of the more experienced tracer players in this league, so I think he'll have an easy time probably dealing with a lot of the lesser talent. So I think that's an area where they can beat up on a lot of other players. Smex has been like a dominant off-tank player when it was more Roadhog meta, and I think we're leaning away from that, but we'll have to see if he's able to learn actually other supports or other off tanks and see what he can do. I haven't seen a lot of Stratus. I know he was like on a top tier 2 team before in Rocket, but haven't seen a lot of him, so we'll have to see what he can do in this league. Next we'll move to XL2. XL2, my team's only played against this team once, and it was kind of weird just for the fact that we were not practicing Sombra meta and they were, just for the fact of how trials were. But I think they have like a really, really strong support core in here. Adam is a very strong caller. Goliath is a very strong flex support. I think both of them they very much complement each other in the supports that they can play. I don't think there will be any support combo that they both cannot play. Mangachu's really committed himself into making himself a better player. I thought he was a super underwhelming DPS player before that was like forced to play off tank. He was kind of in like a Zom situation, but I think he's really committed himself, and I think he'll be able to play Pharah. I still am not 100% on his Genji, but I've seen him improve it a lot, so we'll have to see it in tournament play. Clone Man's been kind of hovering around this like weird tier 2 scene, kind of being on like a few teams, but not really making the dive into pro play yet. I don't think that's commitment at all. I think he's been very committed to actually improving and being a really good player. So I think he's a good main tank. The Korean, I'm not so sure about. Not so sure. I've not really seen him a lot. No, never mind. I'm forgetting. It has his Korean name, not his actual English pronunciation of it, NA or whatever he wants to pronounce it as. But he was on good rosters. It was the later iterations of Lunatic High, so I'd have to watch more of him. The time we played against him, he seemed to know what he wanted to do and was pretty dominant doing it, so maybe they can play around that. Midnight's been kind of hovering around that tier 2 scene as well for a while, so I think they have a pretty strong roster. I think maybe it's just their DPS that might lack against the higher tier teams, but I think as a middle of the pack or top end team, I think they'll do pretty good for themselves. Next move to Gladiators. Gladiators is the team we've played against and scrimmed against the most, and I'm like really thankful for them because I think this roster is actually amazing. I think there is a lot of pieces in this roster that make a lot of sense, and as a roster, it's probably the most understood and well put together roster. Maybe Fusion is the one that can compete with it the most, but I think a lot of the pieces in this roster really complement each other. So you have a lot of former teammates here in this team. If you can just like link all the two together, there's a lot of people who've played with each other and they've played in the scene. A lot of experience between all these players. A lot of them have been playing for a really long time. I think the support lineup makes a lot of sense. Pooks, the times that we've played against him and I've seen him, he's been like a really solid, good player, where I think he was kind of left behind by his old team in Kangana. Like a lot of the players moved up and he kind of sat behind, but I think he's really deserving of this roster, and I think this roster can do a lot of good things. Rolf has been in like a staple of like the tier 1 scene, like a little bit under that in Cloud9, and I think he's been like a really good Zen player who's been kind of like let down by his teams, I think, in Cloud9, where I think he could have been on a better roster. Maybe Cloud9 could have succeeded more with different pieces in it, because I think he was an actually really good piece in that. Gods in Cloud9 was like a little bit questionable. I wasn't sure exactly what they wanted him to do. They seemed to bring him on like as a DPS and then kind of just like switch the tank role around. It didn't make a lot of sense. He ended up picking that diva role up more often later, and I think it's really worked for him because he can play like an actual flexible role now, where he's like an actual flex tank where he can play all the tanks that he needs to. He's really good at all of them, and he's really taken a keen to getting good at diva, and his diva is actually really impressive now. And then he also can flex to DPS if he needs to, if there's some weird meta switch or anything. So I think their DPS may be like a little bit lacking just to Fusion and Envision, but besides that, I think it's probably going to be really close. Their tank line's really strong, their support line's really strong. Koryo's been like a really good staple hit scan player for like a long time, but I'm not sure if he's going to be able to compete with anyone at like Owl level. So I think he's at a good place where he is, and this is definitely one of my top picks for this league, and I think they're going to do really well. Let's move on to Envision. Sadly, Envision couldn't get this #1 spot because they've struggled against Fusion, and I think it's because they're running into Houston Outlaws syndrome of having 2 flex DPS players, not really having a tracer player. I know Buds is trying to move into the role, but I think they're still trying to figure this out. I think Buds is more committed to the role, but initially they were playing with Jaru on tracer and then having Buds play flex, and then they've kind of swapped it back, but I'm not exactly sure if they're sold on that or if they want to pick up another tracer player. I think in a meta where it was more Soldier, Junkrat, McCree Junkrat, I think they would fit well in Owl, where you can run Widow Junkrat and just a lot of Junkrat that you can run. I think that would really work for this team, but it's not as apparent in the tier 2 scene that you can run that as much. They were running a lot of Tracer Soldier and just running that all the time, and I think that's fine, but I'm not sure if they have like as dominant as a Tracer player to really compete for that #1 spot. So their supports here are excellent. Crimzo is a wonderful addition to this roster. I think he was really hard stuck in his last few teams, and I think he's really climbed to a spot where he deserves. Fire has been like a staple, insanely good Lucio player, very skilled shot caller. McGravy is really good at calming. iShiny is probably the most questionable person on this roster, but I think having such a stable roster around you of good players who are very skilled, very proven, it's really just his chance to shine, no pun intended, and really grow into himself and see if he can actually fit well into this team, as they are, I predict, to be the 2nd place team. And then Fusion. Fusion, I think, just makes sense as a roster. It's well thought out. They knew coming into this, we're going to make a young roster. We're going to make a very young roster that can grow into like Owl potential, and then probably sell them off or push them up to their actual Philadelphia team. So I think having such a young roster, you can just incorporate so many things where you're just like teaching them, you can mold them into the team that you want to, and they have a lot of insanely good pieces here. Their Koreans are amazing. Like, Who Are You is definitely like the best player in this league, probably, if not one of the top. Alarm is up there. I think their support core really works well together. They're both super young, both very eager to win the games. Who Are You, Zachary work well together because I think Zachary is like a pretty good flexible DPS. He's not a flex DPS, but I think he can fit well into a tracer role. There isn't as many dominant tracers in this league, and with the way he plays, it seems like he can play like a Sabiolbi kind of style with his tracer and really just look to dominate any other tracers in this league. Who Are You isn't really a flexible player. He's really struggled when you put him on Soldier, when you force him on Soldier. His Roadhog is, I'd say it's pretty top tier. His Genji is by far the best thing that you can play, and I think that'll really work for him. I think if we swap more into a Sombra meta, maybe he'll struggle a little bit, but maybe they can switch the roles up because Who Are You was playing Tracer before for Lunatic Eye, so we'll see what they can do. Beast Halo has been kind of hovering around tier 2 scene as well for a long time. Him and Kraken both have, and I think they'll work really well as a team because if you have young players and you're teaching them this playstyle where you just create as much room as possible for Who Are You, and you have this success of, okay, I'm going to be trading my life for Who Are You, and Who Are You is just going to be exceptional and clean up all the fights, it'll really like sell it to you that like, okay, what I'm doing is correct and I'll just keep doing it. Where I think if you had an older player who's a little bit more hardened and like has seen like a lot of different meta changes and things, and maybe he'll play like a little bit safer style, but if you have a young Winston player and you teach him this style and it's really working for you, I think it'll really pay off, and like he'll really understand that this is the style that you need to play with Who Are You, and create a lot of room for him and give him a lot of resources, and he'll really just carry you to championships. And so I think this roster makes a lot of sense, and I think them, Envision, and Gladiators are definitely my top 3 favorites for this entire league, and I really, really expect them to perform well. And I think them performing well is just going to mean good things for Overwatch League. So future spots, of the Overwatch League are really going to be picking pieces of this, or just picking up entire rosters from here, because these are really top teams.